I came home from work that Tuesday expecting the usual. My gravel driveway, the comforting creak of my porch swing in the late afternoon sun, and maybe a glass of iced tea as dusk settled in. But instead, what I found hit me like a slap. Gray, thick, white concrete, still gleaming under the lowering sun, hard enough to block my truck from parking where it always had. I stopped dead in the middle of the street, blinked twice, then got out of my car and stood there staring. The entire driveway was gone. In its place was a freshly poured slab of concrete stretching from my gate to the garage. It was as if it had always been there, but it hadn't. I would have known. I should have known. There was no notice taped to my door, no email, no HOA bulletin, no knock, nothing. I walked around it carefully, stepping over some flimsy warning tape that hadn't even been set up properly. It dangled from a sad stick, stuck in the ground like an afterthought. I crouched down, touched the corner. It was still slightly damp, still soft, still fresh. This wasn't a renovation. This was a violation. At first, my instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion. Who did this? Why? I reached for my phone, snapped a dozen pictures from every angle, then opened the HOA app on my phone. No announcements. No alerts. I called the HOA number, but it rang 5 times, then went straight to voicemail. So, I drove around to the HOA office located 2 blocks away, behind a locked gate. It was closed. A note on the door said, "Back Wednesday, leave all inquiries via email." I stood there, fists clenched. Wednesday? This wasn't just disrespect. It was audacity. This was my land. I paid the mortgage. I mowed the lawn. I maintained the trees that shaded the driveway in summer. I had never received a violation notice for that driveway. And now, without warning, it had been torn out and replaced with something I never asked for. I called my neighbor, Dave, who lived across the street. He came over, shook his head. They did the same thing 2 blocks over, he said. Last week, poured concrete where the Simmons family had a cobblestone path. HOA said something about uniformity upgrades. Uniformity at whose expense? As I stared at the concrete cooling under the weight of the evening sun, a sick feeling crept up my spine. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And I had been chosen, or maybe targeted, to go first on this block. Back inside, I opened my property folder. Every homeowner in the development had one handed over by the title company years ago. I flipped past my mortgage documents, utility maps, property tax breakdowns, and then there with a parcel map, driveway, easement right. The line was clear. My driveway was 100 fan tram on my parcel, not shared, not HOA maintained, and not open to arbitrary upgrades. I grabbed a pen and circled it. Then I wrote 3 words under the photocopy: start the fight. Because this wasn't just about cement. It was about ownership. It was about autonomy. It was about standing up to a board that thought they could pour over my boundaries, literally and figuratively, and face no resistance. But they had picked the wrong driveway. I knew what came next. I needed proof. I needed clarity. I needed the law. But most of all, I needed patience because this was going to get messy before it got clean. The next morning, the concrete had dried perfect, smooth, smug in the way it reflected the morning sun. But something else was stirring inside me now. Something sharper than confusion, colder than annoyance. I walked around my property, clipboard in hand, documenting everything: the lot boundaries, the grass line, the property markers near the side fence. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Because if the HOA had overstepped, I needed to show it, not just say it. Before heading to work, I called the city zoning office. I was polite, calm, curious. "Hi, I just have a quick question. Would there be any reason the HOA could pour concrete on a private homeowner's land without a permit or notice?" The man on the other end, Mark, paused. "Well, it depends. If the HOA owns the land, they might be authorized. But if it's a private parcel, they'd need explicit written permission from the owner, and they'd still need to file a project notice if it affects surface grading, water flow, or entry." "And what if they didn't do any of that?" I asked. Mark chuckled lightly. "Then someone has a problem on their hands, and it's not you." That was enough fuel to carry me through the workday. But when I got home, there was a surprise waiting in my mailbox. A glossy envelope with the HOA's logo. Inside, a letter formatted like a thank you card. "Dear homeowner, as part of our ongoing property enhancement initiative, your driveway was selected for complimentary upgrade and uniformity compliance. No action is required from you. This update is part of a community-wide improvement effort that will increase home values and improve aesthetic cohesion. We thank you for your cooperation. No name signed. No contact number. Just a seal that read, HOA Beautification and Standards Committee. I read it 3 times. They had the nerve to call it a gift. I turned the paper over and scribbled across the back, "Not on my land." The next morning, I went straight to the HOA office. This time, it was open. Carla, the woman behind the glass window, greeted me with a rehearsed smile. "Good morning. How can I help?" "I want to speak to whoever approved the driveway work on my property," I said. She blinked. "Oh, were you one of the upgrades? Isn't it beautiful?" I kept my voice steady. "I didn't authorize it, and I want to know who did." Carla's tone tightened. She tapped her fingers on the edge of her desk. "All improvements were approved through the committee. You should have received our standard notice." "I didn't," I replied. "And more importantly, I own that land. I have the parcel map. This was not a shared drive. This was mine." She hesitated, then offered a brittle smile. "If you have a concern, you can file a formal dispute. Here's the form." I took the paper but didn't leave. "Will you tell me who oversees this committee?" "I'm not authorized to share names," she said, voice clipped. "But your concern will be reviewed in our next monthly meeting." A month. I didn't blink. That's the process? I stared at her for a moment longer, then turned and walked out. Back home, I filled out the form. But I also wrote an email directly to the city's zoning office and CC'd the local building inspector. I attached the pictures, the HOA's letter, and my parcel map. I titled it, "Unauthorized Construction on Private Land HOA Overreach." I clicked send. Then I set up a motion camera on my porch, just in case someone decided to come back with a sledgehammer or another bucket of cement. Because this wasn't just about who did it. It was about how far they thought they could go without being stopped. I wasn't planning to yell or argue or stage a protest. I was going to build something much stronger than noise. A paper trail. A pattern. A case that no HOA meeting could silence. They thought this was finished, but I had just begun. By the end of the week, I had responses from 3 different people at the city's planning department, each more concerned than the last. Mark, my original contact, looped in a zoning enforcement officer named Janelle. She wasted no time. "I reviewed the parcel map. That driveway is definitely on your property," she said. "I also checked our records. No permit was filed. That's a direct violation of municipal code." I let that message sit in my inbox for a moment before reading it again. It wasn't just validation. It was leverage. Still, something nagged at me. Why my driveway? Why now? I remembered something. 2 months ago, I had received a letter about a future development initiative. It mentioned improvements to shared spaces, sidewalks, and strategic access optimization. At the time, I thought it was typical bureaucratic fluff, but buried in the middle was a reference to unified frontage aesthetics for entry corridors. My lot, my driveway, was the first house on Eastvale Drive. They were trying to turn my private driveway into a shared access corridor, and they started with the concrete. I opened Google Earth, pulling up satellite images from the past 5 years. I zoomed in on the neighborhood layout. My driveway was one of only 3 that extended past the standard sidewalk easement. It jutted out farther than most, leading to a small garden shed I had built myself. In HOA eyes, it probably looked like a blemish. In reality, it was a right I owned in writing. I saved the images, screenshotted timestamps, filed it all under a new folder, HOA Concrete Incident. Then I did something even more important. I called my neighbor, Dan. He lived 2 doors down since before the HOA even existed. If anyone had seen something, it was him. "Did you see who poured that concrete last week?" I asked him. He didn't hesitate. "Yeah, that guy Mike from Superior Surfacing. Same crew that did the clubhouse parking lot last month." "Did you hear anything about them getting permission?" Dan snorted. "Permission? Please. HOA's been talking about connecting the driveways on this side for a while. Said it would make it more presentable for Wysiders." There it was. A whisper turned fact. I asked Dan to write it down. He did and emailed it 5 minutes later. The next morning, Janelle from zoning emailed again. The city was dispatching an inspector to take photos and open a case. She warned me that it might take time. Code enforcement always did, but encouraged me to keep gathering documentation. I printed every photo, email, and letter and clipped it all into a binder labeled "Saw Property Invasion Saw." And just when I thought I'd hit a lull, something arrived in the mail that lit the fuse for what came next. An HOA compliance reminder slip was pinned to my door. It read, "Notice of violation. Your front garden shed is not in alignment with the new driveway overlay and must be removed within 14 days to maintain visual cohesion and prevent runoff obstruction." It was the first violation notice I'd ever received. Not for noise, not for weeds, but for a structure that had been there for 8 years with city-approved plans. This wasn't enforcement. This was pressure. They buried my driveway in concrete, pretended it was a favor, and now they were trying to bulldoze my shed using their own improvement as the justification. But they had no idea what I was building. Not just a folder, not just a file, a case. I stood on that illegally poured concrete and promised myself they would learn what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the law. Because this wasn't about concrete anymore. It was about ownership, boundaries, consent, and I was done asking nicely. The next morning, I returned to the city office. This time, Janelle met me in person. She took one look at my binder, nodded, and called in a zoning enforcement team. "This may take a few days," she warned, "but it's a serious breach." She didn't say it out loud, but I could see it in her eyes. This was the kind of case that set precedent. HOA overreach was one thing. Blatant disregard for property law was another. You could feel the shift in the air when we left City Hall. We were getting somewhere now.